A plane crash in DeKalb, Texas on December the 31st, 1985 got the attention of the world. Singer Ricky Nelson was on that plane.
In the final stages of their approach, something happened. Either some cars got in their way or something, and they elected to go to a field. And it appeared to me that they probably hit into some trees.
He was famous before he could drive. A teenage idol who sold millions of records, starred alongside John Wayne. But when Ricky Nelson died in a plane crash at 45 years old, the world assumed his massive wealth was long gone, swallowed up by divorce, debt, and decades of financial chaos, until someone looked closely enough. So what was really hiding inside his estate that made his family filthy rich? How does a man everyone thought was broke leave behind a fortune that changed his children's lives forever? Join us as we uncover the fortune nobody saw coming. A childhood sacrificed for fame. Ricky Nelson was born on May 8, 1940 in Teaneck, New Jersey, into a family where entertainment was not just a hobby, it was everything. It was the air they breathed, the reason they got up in the morning, and the thing that defined them to the rest of the world. His father was Ozzie Nelson, a well-known bandleader and performer, and his mother was Harriet Nelson, a singer and actress with a warm smile that audiences adored. And together they built a career around being likable, polished, and always on show. When Ricky was still very young, the family landed a radio program called The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, a show where Ozzie and Harriet played themselves, a regular American couple raising their two boys, David and Ricky, and the audience loved it because it felt real, warm, and familiar. Then television arrived, and in 1952, the show moved from radio to TV screens across the country, bringing the Nelson family into millions of living rooms every single week, and Ricky was just 12 years old when the cameras began following his every move. To the audience, he looked like the luckiest boy in America, but behind that bright, polished picture, something far more complicated was already beginning to form. Most children spend their early years making friends, exploring the world, and slowly figuring out who they are. But Ricky Nelson spent those years in front of cameras, performing a version of himself that someone else had written for him. By the time he was 10 years old, he was already one of the most recognized young faces in America, appearing week after week on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, with lines to memorize, scenes to film, and a carefully managed image to maintain. And there was no summer break from it, no quiet year away, no chance to simply disappear and be a normal boy. His father, Ozzie, controlled almost everything, producing the show, writing the scripts, and deciding exactly how the family was presented to the world. And because Ozzie held the purse strings too, whatever money young Ricky earned flowed straight through his father's hands, leaving Ricky with very little understanding of what he was worth or where his earnings went. Growing up inside that system left a deep mark on him because his personality, his taste, and even his image were not things he chose freely. They were things that were handed to him, shaped by audience approval, his father's ambitions, and the demands of a television show that needed him to stay likable, clean, and uncomplicated. Some children in that situation accept it quietly and never question it, but Ricky was already starting to feel the edges of something he could not yet name. Before those feelings surfaced, however, his father made a bold move that would send Ricky's life in a direction nobody had fully expected. Ricky's engineered stardom. Ricky Nelson did not stumble into music by accident. His father Ozzie saw an opportunity and took it with both hands, understanding that the television show gave them something most musicians could only dream of, a direct line into millions of American homes every single week. The plan was simple but clever, used the show to launch Ricky as a recording artist, and in 1957 that plan was put into action when Ricky performed a cover of Fats Domino's song I'm Walking on Screen, and the response from the audience was immediate and overwhelming, with fans flooding record stores the very next day. His follow-up single Bebop Baby sold over 1 million copies, and suddenly Ricky Nelson was not just a television personality, he was a genuine music star, with screaming fans, radio play, and a career that seemed to have no ceiling. His debut album Ricky shot straight to #1, and then came the moment that confirmed everything. A song called Poor Little Fool became the very first #1 on the brand new Billboard Hot 100 chart, putting his name in the history books before he had even turned 18 years old. Ricky was performing alongside some of the biggest names in the country, selling out shows. He was earning the kind of fame that very few people ever reach, and it all looked effortless from the outside, but behind the perfect smile and the hit records, a very different story was quietly beginning to unfold. The difference between the image and reality. To the world, watching from their living rooms and buying his records, Ricky Nelson was everything a young star was supposed to be. Clean, polite, handsome, and completely in control. A boy next door who just happened to sell millions of records and make girls scream. He was quietly involved in multiple relationships that the public never heard about, moving through his teenage years with the kind of freedom his fame allowed behind closed doors. Even while the cameras presented him as wholesome and uncomplicated, and the tension between those two worlds was growing stronger with every passing year. His parents, particularly his father Ozzy, kept tight restrictions on what Ricky could say, do, and be seen doing in public. And those restrictions created a resentment that Ricky struggled to express openly because the show required harmony, and harmony had to be performed whether it was felt or not. He was becoming two people at once: the polished television son that America believed in, and a young man underneath who was quietly pushing against every wall around him, searching for something that felt genuinely his own. The cracks were small at first and easy to hide, but as his fame grew bigger, so did the pressure holding everything together, and at the very peak of that fame, the numbers told a story that almost nobody could quite believe. Peak fame and expanding influence. Between 1957 and 1962, Ricky Nelson placed 20 songs in the top 40 charts, a run of success so consistent and so impressive that only one artist in the entire country was doing better, and that artist was Elvis Presley. That fact alone tells you everything about where Ricky stood during those years. He was not just popular, he was one of the defining voices of a generation, filling radios, jukeboxes, and concert halls with a sound that felt effortless and cool, and the fans could not get enough of him. His success was not limited to music either, and in 1959 he stepped onto the big screen alongside Hollywood legend John Wayne in the film Rio Bravo, holding his own against one of the most respected actors in the world, and earning praise that proved he was more than just a pretty face with a guitar. As the money poured in, so did the lifestyle that came with it. Expensive homes, first-class travel, elite social circles, and a growing taste for the kind of luxury that felt completely natural when you were one of the most famous young men in America. He was living at the very top, surrounded by success, admired by millions, and generating wealth at a pace that seemed like it would never slow down. But the music world was about to be shaken to its core by something arriving from across the ocean, something that would make even the biggest American stars question everything they had built. Industry shift and career decline. In 1964, something happened that changed popular music forever, and no American artist was fully prepared for it, not even the ones sitting at the very top of the charts. The Beatles arrived from England, and with them came a wave of new sounds, new energy, and a completely different idea of what a pop star could look and feel like. And American audiences turned towards that wave with an enthusiasm that left many established artists standing in its wake, wondering what had just happened to the world they knew. Ricky Nelson felt that shift as clearly as anyone. His record sales began to fall, radio play dried up, and the teenage fans who had once screamed his name were now plastering their bedroom walls with photographs of 4 young men from Liverpool, and there was very little Ricky could do to change that. He did not give up though. Instead, he reinvented himself, forming a new group called the Stone Canyon Band and moving his sound away from the polished pop of his early years and towards a looser, more honest country rock style that he genuinely believed in, drawing influence from artists like Bob Dylan and the emerging sounds coming out of the American heartland. The music he made during this period was well respected by critics and fellow musicians who understood what he was trying to do, but commercial success was a different matter entirely, and the record sales never came close to matching what he had achieved in his peak years, leaving a growing gap between the artist he was becoming and the income he needed to survive. He played on regardless, pouring himself into the music, touring whenever he could, and refusing to simply disappear. But the financial pressure building quietly in the background was about to collide with a much more personal kind of pressure, and that collision would begin with a wedding, marriage, and financial pressure. In 1963, at the age of 22, Ricky Nelson married Kristen Harmon, the daughter of football star Tom Harmon, and on the surface, it looked like the kind of union that belonged on the cover of a magazine. 2 attractive young people from famous families starting a life together in the spotlight. But the truth underneath was more complicated, because the marriage came with pressures attached from the very beginning. Pressures from family expectations, from public image, and from a lifestyle that both of them had grown up inside without ever being taught how to manage it responsibly. Kristen came from a world of wealth and comfort, and the life she and Ricky built together reflected that. Large homes, expensive travel, household staff, and a standard of living that made perfect sense when the hit records were still coming, but became increasingly difficult to justify as Ricky's commercial fortunes began to fade. The problem was that the spending never slowed down to match the changing reality. The homes stayed large, the travel stayed expensive, and the bills kept arriving with the same regularity even as the royalty checks grew smaller and the touring income proved inconsistent and unreliable. Ricky had never been taught to manage money carefully. His earnings as a child and young man had always passed through other hands first. His father's hands, his label's hands, and by the time he was running his own finances, he had no real foundation to build on, no framework for understanding what was coming in versus what was going out. Debt began to quietly accumulate in the background, small at first, then larger, then impossible to ignore, spreading through his finances like a slow leak that nobody was moving fast enough to fix. While the money problems grew, So did the distance inside the marriage itself, until one day that distance became impossible to ignore. Collapse of family and finances. For years, Ricky Nelson held two crumbling things together at the same time: a marriage that was falling apart behind closed doors and a financial situation that was sliding steadily towards ruin, and he kept holding them both together through sheer force of public image, because admitting failure was not something the world's idea of Ricky Nelson was supposed to do. The marriage to Kristen had been difficult for a long time, filled with emotional distance, private arguments, and two people who had grown into very different versions of themselves from the young couple who had stood together at the altar back in 1963, and no amount of public appearances or carefully managed interviews could paper over what was happening behind the scenes. The moment that made the separation impossible to deny came when Ricky arrived home one day to find that the locks had been changed, standing outside his own front door with nowhere to go. And that single moment collapsed the pretense entirely, making real what both of them had known for a long time but had refused to say out loud. The divorce was finalized in 1982, and it was devastating in every practical sense, costing approximately $1 million in legal fees alone, with ongoing child support obligations added on top of that. Obligations that would follow Ricky for the rest of his life, regardless of how his income fluctuated. He had 4 children to support, a lifestyle he could no longer fully afford, a music career that was generating a fraction of what it once had, and a debt burden that had grown far beyond anything that could be quietly managed or ignored. He was not broke in the way that makes headlines, but he was financially cornered, and the only way he knew how to fight back was to keep touring, keep performing, and keep moving. But the decisions he would make next, driven by financial desperation, would put far more than his bank balance at risk. Desperation and risk escalation. By the mid-1980s, Ricky Nelson was trapped in a cycle that he could not seem to break, touring constantly to generate income, spending what he earned to maintain a lifestyle that had grown too large and falling further behind no matter how hard he worked or how many shows he played. Touring was exhausting, but it was the only reliable source of income he had left, so he pushed through city after city, night after night, performing for audiences who remembered the golden years and came out to relive them. And Ricky delivered every time because he was a professional and because he genuinely had no other choice. To keep the tours running without eating up every dollar of profit on travel costs, Ricky purchased his own aircraft, a 1944 Douglas DC-3, a propeller plane that had originally been built during the Second World War and had been flying in various forms for decades since. And while it was a practical solution on paper, those around him had serious concerns from the very beginning. The plane had a troubled history, mechanical warnings had been raised more than once, people who knew aircraft looked at it and felt uneasy, and there were voices urging Ricky to address the problems properly or find a different solution entirely. But the financial pressure he was living under made caution feel like a luxury he simply could not afford. He kept flying, kept touring, and kept pushing forward because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. What happened next would silence everything. The crash and immediate aftermath. On December 31st, 1985, Ricky Nelson boarded his DC-3 with his band and several members of his touring crew, heading to a New Year's Eve performance in Dallas, Texas. A show like dozens of others he had played that year. Another night, another city, another stage. The plane never arrived. Somewhere over DeKalb, Texas, a fire broke out inside the cabin while the aircraft was still in the air, and the pilots attempted an emergency landing in a field below, but the plane came down hard, and when it finally stopped moving, 7 people were dead, including Ricky Nelson, who was just 45 years old. The news traveled fast, and the grief that followed was enormous, because even though his commercial peak had passed, Ricky Nelson had never stopped meaning something to the people who grew up with him. And losing him on the last night of the year felt cruel in a way that was hard to put into words. In the immediate aftermath, attention turned to what he had left behind, and the early picture was not encouraging. Those close to the situation believed his estate was heavily burdened with debt, that legal obligations and years of financial mismanagement had consumed most of what he had ever earned, and that his 4 children would inherit little beyond his name and his memory. It seemed like the story was over, and that the ending was a sad one, but someone was about to look more closely, and what they found would change everything. Investigators soon began examining the wreckage, searching for answers about what had caused the deadly fire. Early theories pointed in different directions. Some believed a mechanical failure inside the aging aircraft may have triggered the disaster, while others suspected problems connected to the cabin heater system. Reports later suggested that passengers may have tried to escape the smoke by moving toward the cockpit, desperately searching for fresh air as the situation inside the plane became unbearable. The final moments were described as chaotic and terrifying. For Ricky Nelson's family, however, the technical details did little to ease the pain. His children suddenly found themselves dealing not only with grief, but also with the overwhelming task of sorting through his complicated financial affairs and public legacy. Fans gathered outside radio stations and memorial sites across the country, mourning a performer whose music had become deeply connected to American culture during the 1950s and 60s. To many people, Ricky Nelson represented youth, nostalgia, and a simpler era that now seemed gone forever. But But as lawyers, accountants, and family members continued digging deeper into his business holdings, royalty agreements, and long-forgotten contracts, a very different story slowly began to emerge behind the headlines. What if Ricky Nelson had actually left behind far more than anyone originally believed? The hidden fortune and final resolution. When Ricky's older brother, David Nelson, began looking carefully into the estate, he discovered something that nobody had expected. A will that was clear, deliberate, and quietly significant, leaving everything Ricky owned to his 4 children, Tracy, Matthew, Gunnar, and Sam, and specifically excluding his ex-wife Kristen, his fiancée at the time of his death, and a man named Eric Jude Crew, who had been attempting to claim a connection to the estate. The will was just the beginning though, because buried inside Ricky's assets was something far more valuable than anyone had initially realized. His music catalog, decades worth of recordings, master rights, and the royalties attached to songs that had never stopped being played, licensed, and sold in various forms around the world. Legal battles followed, some challenging the will itself, others involving wrongful death claims connected to the crash, and all of them took years to resolve. But the children fought through every one of them with the help of determined legal representation. The most significant battles were fought against the music industry itself. A lawsuit against Capitol Records exposed income that had been hidden or misreported over many years, and a separate action against Sony Music Entertainment revealed that streaming royalty rates had been quietly calculated in ways that severely shortchanged the estate. Both cases resulted in settlements, with millions of dollars recovered and royalty structures renegotiated to reflect what the catalog was genuinely worth. By the time everything was resolved, Ricky Nelson's 4 children were wealthy, his legacy was financially restored, and the fortune that everyone assumed was gone had simply been waiting to be found. What made the outcome even more remarkable was the timing. At the moment of Ricky Nelson's death, many people believed his career had faded and that his financial success belonged entirely to the past. Few understood how valuable classic music catalogs would eventually become in the modern entertainment industry. As streaming services, digital downloads, television licensing, and nostalgic re-releases expanded over the years, the value of Ricky's recordings continued growing far beyond what anyone in the 1980s could have predicted. Songs that once played on vinyl records were suddenly reaching entirely new generations of listeners around the world. For his children, the recovery of the estate became about more than money. It was also about protecting their father's name and ensuring that his work received the recognition and compensation it deserved. In many ways, the long legal fight transformed a tragic ending into a story of redemption. Ricky Nelson's music outlived the rumors of debt, the confusion after the crash, and the years of uncertainty surrounding his estate. Today, his legacy stands not as the story of a forgotten star who died broke, but as the story of an artist whose true worth was discovered only after his death. But if David Nelson had never looked deeper into the estate, would the hidden fortune and Ricky's restored legacy have ever been uncovered at all? If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.